Belittled at every family gathering, I watched my father praise everyone but me. He called my startup cute hobbies while celebrating my cousin's corporate job. What he didn't know: I'd just acquired the company where they all worked. When Christmas dinner turned into my public humiliation, I smiled, because the HR rejection letters had my signature on them. Welcome to Revenge with Precious, where we share real stories of betrayal, resilience, and the courage to stand up for yourself. These are tales of people who refused to stay silent, who drew boundaries when love turned toxic, and who chose their peace over family obligation. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, these stories are for you. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that might change how you see your own life. Please, watch till the end. Let's get started. The crystal chandelier swayed slightly as my father's voice cut through the Christmas chatter. 23 relatives crammed into the dining room, plates piled high with glazed ham and roasted potatoes, but suddenly every fork paused mid-air. Some people, Dad said, his tone casual but pointed, just never figure out how the real world works. His eyes found mine across the table. My stomach tightened, recognizing the setup. This wasn't new. Every holiday, every birthday, every gathering became his stage to remind everyone that while my siblings climbed corporate ladders, I remained the family disappointment. Still doing those little design projects, he continued, swirling red wine in his glass. My Aunt Petra chuckled softly. My cousin Brighton, seated at Dad's right hand like a prince, smirked into his napkin. Meanwhile, Dad raised his glass higher. Brighton just landed a position at Thorn Logistics. Real salary. Real benefits. Real future. The room erupted in applause. Brighton stood, accepting handshakes and congratulations, his smile wide and practiced. My father beamed with pride he'd never shown me, not once in 28 years. I stayed seated, fingers wrapped around my water glass, watching the performance. The weight of 3 years of silence pressed against my chest. 3 years of building something they couldn't see. 3 years of letting them believe I was struggling while I quietly constructed an empire they'd never imagined. My phone buzzed in my pocket. An email notification I'd been expecting for weeks. I glanced at the screen under the table. Acquisition complete. Arlen Group now majority owner of Thorn Logistics. Final signatures approved. I looked up at Brighton's celebration, at my father's glowing face, at the relatives toasting success they thought belonged to someone else. And I smiled. Not from joy. From something colder, sharper. Something earned through years of dismissal and disbelief. Because tomorrow morning, Brighton would receive an email about company restructuring. So would my father's business partner. So would 3 other relatives who'd spent tonight pitying me. And every single email would require approval from one person. Me. The drive home felt longer than usual, streetlights blurring past as I replayed the dinner in my mind. My father's toast echoed, real future. As if everything I'd built existed in some imaginary realm that didn't count because he couldn't see it, couldn't measure it against his outdated metrics of success. I'd learned early that arguing only made it worse. At 16, when I won a regional design competition, he'd said, "That's nice, but art doesn't pay mortgages." At 22, when I chose startup culture over his accounting firm, he told relatives I was lost. When I struggled those first 2 years, eating ramen and working from coffee shops, he'd shake his head at family dinners and say, "See? I warned her." So I stopped defending myself. Stopped explaining. Stopped hoping he'd understand that the world had changed, that business wasn't just suits and handshakes anymore. Instead, I worked. Quietly. Obsessively. I pulled into my apartment complex, the one he'd called temporary for 3 years straight. The lights were off. I liked it that way. Darkness meant privacy, space to think without performance. I opened my laptop at the kitchen counter, the blue glow illuminating contract documents I'd been reviewing for months. Arlen Group, the name I'd chosen carefully, my grandmother's maiden name, the one person who'd believed in me before she passed. Started as a freelance design studio, evolved into brand consulting, then pivoted into logistics when I realized companies needed more than pretty visuals, they needed systems, efficiency, solutions. The Thorn Logistics acquisition was my biggest move yet. And tomorrow, the real work began. Morning arrived with winter sun slicing through thin curtains. I made coffee, black and strong, and opened my email. 43 new messages. Most were automated reports, but 3 caught my attention. Brighton Whitmore employee transfer request. Petra Whitmore vendor partnership inquiry. Gerald Whitmore senior advisory position application. My father. Applying to advise at a company he didn't know I owned. The irony tasted sweeter than the coffee. I forwarded everything to Darcy, my HR director. She'd joined Arlen Group 8 months ago, pulled from a failing startup where her talent was wasted. She understood my vision immediately: build something sustainable, treat people fairly, and never let ego cloud judgment. Handle these applications like any others, I typed. No special treatment. Evaluate purely on merit and company needs. Her response came within minutes: understood. Though I have to say, the universe has a sense of humor. I smiled, closing the laptop. The next phase required patience. Restructuring took time. Interviews needed scheduling. References required checking. Everything had to appear normal, professional, completely by the book. Because this wasn't revenge, it was simply business operating as it should, without nepotism, without assumptions, without the privilege my father had always taken for granted. My phone rang. Mom's name flashed across the screen. I hesitated, then answered. Kiara, her voice was soft, apologetic. About last night, your father didn't mean. He meant it, Mom. He always does. Silence stretched between us, familiar and heavy. You've built something, haven't you? She finally asked. Something he doesn't know about. I didn't answer. Didn't need to. Be careful, she whispered. Pride is a dangerous thing to wound. The call ended. 2 years earlier, I'd been living in a studio apartment where the bathroom door didn't close properly and the radiator clanged like angry ghosts at 3 a.m. My client list fit on a single page. My bank account fluctuated between 3 and 4 digits, never 5. But I had something my father's generation didn't understand: adaptability. When a local bakery needed a logo redesign, I delivered it in 2 days. When they asked if I knew anyone who could manage their supplier relationships, I said yes, then spent a weekend learning everything about small business logistics. When their delivery system collapsed during holiday rush, I built them a digital tracking solution using free software and YouTube tutorials. Word spread. Not through corporate networks or professional associations, but through the tight web of small business owners who texted each other at midnight and traded solutions over coffee. A print shop owner knew a boutique owner who knew a restaurant manager. Each one needed help with something different: inventory systems, marketing campaigns, vendor negotiations, staff scheduling. I said yes to everything, learned what I didn't know, delivered results. 6 months in, I had 12 clients. A year later, 30. My studio apartment became an office with 2 freelancers working remotely. Then 4. Then 8. My father called occasionally, his questions always the same: still doing the freelance thing? The subtext was clear: when are you going to get a real job? I stopped answering those calls. At family gatherings, I became invisible by design. While my siblings discussed quarterly earnings and corporate politics, I sat at the far end of the table, nodding politely when addressed, volunteering nothing. My brother Callum worked in finance, something involving overseas investments and conference calls with Singapore. My sister Theodora managed a non-profit, endlessly fundraising for causes that looked impressive on her social media. Both made our parents proud in conventional, measurable ways. Then there was me, the creative one, Dad would say, as if it were a diagnosis. She's always been different. Different meant lesser in his vocabulary. Different meant unemployable, impractical, destined for struggle. Brighton, my cousin, became his surrogate success story. 8 years younger than me, he'd graduated with a business degree, completed a corporate training program, and landed at Thorne Logistics as a junior analyst. Nothing extraordinary, but Dad spoke about him like he'd cured cancer. That's what hard work looks like, he'd say, gesturing toward Brighton while looking at me. That's what happens when you make smart choices. I'd smile, fork moving food around my plate, calculations running behind my eyes. Arlen Group had just signed its second major client, a distribution company restructuring after bankruptcy. The contract was worth more than Brighton's annual salary. But I didn't mention it. Didn't correct. Didn't defend. Because I'd learned something my father never understood: true power didn't need announcement. It just needed patience. The first acquisition happened almost by accident. Vantage Shipping, a regional logistics company, was drowning in debt. Their founder, Marcellus, was brilliant with routes but terrible with finance. He'd built a loyal client base, established relationships with manufacturers and retailers, but couldn't keep cash flowing properly. We'd worked together on a project 6 months earlier. I'd redesigned their client portal, implemented automated billing, trained his staff on efficiency protocols. He called me one Tuesday morning, voice thick with exhaustion. "Kiera, I'm shutting down. I can't do this anymore." I'd been standing in my apartment, coffee getting cold in my hand, watching snow drift past the window. "Don't decide yet," I said. "Let me look at your books." 3 weeks later, Arlen Group acquired Vantage Shipping. Marcellus stayed on as operations director, his expertise now supported by proper financial management. His staff kept their jobs. His clients never noticed the transition. But suddenly, my company had infrastructure. Vehicles. Warehouse contracts. Distribution networks. My father called that month, asking about Thanksgiving plans. "You coming home? Or are you too busy with your projects?" "I'll be there," I said, watching contract signatures dry on my desk. He never asked what the projects were. Never showed enough interest to search my name online, where articles about emerging logistics innovators had started mentioning Arlen Group. Invisibility had become my advantage. Christmas lights blinked against the living room window, casting red and green shadows across papers spread on my coffee table. Acquisition documents. Market analysis. Projection reports. Outside, carolers moved through the neighborhood, their voices muffled by falling snow. Thorne Logistics had been on my radar for 8 months. They operated in the same regional network as Arlen Group, but their management was aging, resistant to digital transformation, bleeding clients to more modern competitors. Their owner, Desmond Thorne, wanted to retire. His children had no interest in the business. He'd been quietly seeking buyers, but his asking price kept potential investors away. I'd sent Darcy to preliminary meetings, keeping my name off documents, letting him think he was negotiating with a faceless corporation. We offered 30% less than his asking price, but guaranteed staff retention, operational autonomy, and a consulting role for Desmond post-sale. He accepted. The signature page came through on December 20th. The same day my father's company newsletter mentioned their strategic partnership discussions with Thorne Logistics, language that meant they were hoping to piggyback off Thorne's client list. Too late. The deal was already done. I closed my laptop, poured wine I'd bought to celebrate but suddenly didn't feel like drinking. Victory was supposed to feel triumphant. Instead, it felt quiet. Necessary. Like closing a door that should have been closed years ago. My phone buzzed. "Mom, Dad wants to know if you're bringing anyone to Christmas dinner." I responded, "Just me." Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. I drove to my parents' house with a bottle of wine and practiced indifference, the kind that only comes from knowing you've already won even if no one else realizes the game is over. The house looked the same as always, 2 stories of brick and tradition, wreaths on every window, Dad's car parked at the perfect angle in the driveway. Inside, voices overlapped, laughter spilling from the kitchen where Mom orchestrated meal prep like a general commanding troops. Brighton arrived with his girlfriend, Sloane, both dressed like they'd stepped from a catalog. He shook hands with uncles, kissed aunts, radiated confidence that came from never being doubted. I hung my coat in the closet, the same closet where I'd hidden from parties as a kid, and joined the gathering. Kiera. Aunt Petra pulled me into a hug that smelled like vanilla perfume and pity. How are you, sweetheart? Still doing the computer thing? Still doing it, I said, smiling. That's so nice. You know, my friend's daughter does graphic design too. Maybe you two should connect. Maybe, I agreed, knowing I'd never follow up, knowing it didn't matter. Dad appeared in the hallway, wearing the sweater Mom bought him, the one that made him look distinguished and successful. His eyes skimmed past me like I was furniture. Brighton, come here, he called. I want you to meet someone. And just like that, I disappeared again. Dinner seated us in birth order, me sandwiched between Callum and my teenage cousin Freya, who spent the entire meal texting under the table. Across from me, Brighton held court, discussing Thorne logistics like he'd built the company himself. The infrastructure is impressive, he said, cutting his ham with surgical precision. Old school, but solid. With proper modernization, we could increase efficiency by 40%. Dad nodded, engaged in a way he never was with my work. That's the kind of thinking companies need. Strategic. Forward-looking. I sipped water, calculations running. Brighton had been at Thorne for 6 weeks. He knew nothing about their actual operational weaknesses, their failing client retention, their inability to compete with digitally integrated competitors. He was repeating talking points from orientation materials. They're considering expansion, Brighton continued. New routes, better software systems. Really exciting stuff. That's what real opportunity looks like, Dad said, his gaze sliding toward me for just a moment. When you position yourself in the right place, doors open. Theodora jumped in, steering conversation toward her latest fundraiser. I finished eating in silence, observing the dynamics I'd studied my whole life. The hierarchy. The favorites. The unspoken rules about whose success deserved celebration. My phone vibrated. Darcy, Brighton's interview scheduled for January 4th, want me to conduct it, or should we assign someone else? I typed back, you handle it. Standard process. Around me, laughter erupted at someone's joke. I smiled, present but absent, counting down minutes until dessert. After dinner, the men gathered in Dad's study, tradition requiring them to discuss business while women cleaned. I'd always hated the ritual, but tonight I joined the kitchen crew, listening to Mom and Petra gossip about neighbors while scraping plates. Your father's excited about this Thorne situation, Mom said quietly, handing me a dish to dry. He thinks it could be good for his consulting business. I responded, non-committal. He doesn't mean to be hard on you, Kiera. He just worries. I set the dish down carefully. He doesn't worry, Mom. He dismisses. There's a difference. She didn't argue, just handed me another plate, her silence confirming what we both knew. From the study, Dad's voice boomed with laughter, the sound of men congratulating themselves on victories they hadn't earned yet. I imagined them in there, cigars and whiskey, planning futures built on assumptions that were already outdated. Freya appeared beside me, phone still glowing in her hand. Do you ever want to just scream? She asked, too quietly for the adults to hear. I looked at her, this 15-year-old who'd grown up watching the same dynamics I had, learning that some people's dreams mattered more than others. Sometimes, I admitted. But then I remember that success is the best response to doubt. She smiled, understanding more than she should have to at her age. "What do you actually do?" she whispered. "Like, for real?" "I build things," I said. "Things that last." The next morning, Christmas Day, started with the gift exchange ritual. We sat in a circle, taking turns opening presents while everyone watched, a performance of gratitude and surprise. Brighton received an expensive watch from Dad. Callum got cufflinks. Theodora, a donation made in her name to her favorite charity. I unwrapped a gift card to a bookstore and a self-help book titled Finding Your Path, a guide for late bloomers. The room went silent. Mom's face flushed. Dad looked pleased with himself. "Thought you might find it helpful," he said. "Never too late to figure things out." I held the book, feeling its weight, the judgment bound in its pages. Brighton shifted uncomfortably. Theodora examined her fingernails. "Thanks, Dad," I said, voice steady. "Really thoughtful." I set it aside and watched as the exchange continued, each gift carefully chosen to reinforce the family hierarchy. When my turn came to give presents, I distributed them quietly, practical items, nothing expensive, everything appropriate. No one would remember mine. That was intentional. After lunch, Dad pulled Brighton into his study again. Through the half-open door, I heard fragments: "Great opportunity, my connections, let me make some calls." He was trying to leverage relationships he thought he had, pulling strings that no longer existed because the company had changed hands. By February, those connections would mean nothing. The old guard at Thorne would be retired or reassigned. New systems would be implemented. The company Brighton thought he'd joined wouldn't exist anymore. But I didn't warn him. Didn't interfere. Just listened and waited. January arrived with freezing rain and new beginnings. Arlen Group's acquisition became public knowledge in industry circles, announced through professional channels and trade publications. The headline read, "Regional logistics firm acquired by emerging tech-forward competitor." My phone started ringing. Industry contacts, curious investors, potential clients who'd been waiting to see if Arlen Group was legitimate. Each call affirmed what I'd been building toward: credibility, infrastructure, market position. Darcy scheduled the restructuring meetings. Every Thorne employee would be interviewed, evaluated on performance and cultural fit, offered new positions or generous severance packages. We'd done this before with Vantage Shipping. The process was professional, thorough, fair. Brighton's interview came on a Thursday morning. I wasn't present, listening to the recording later from my office while reviewing other candidates. "I'm excited to contribute," Brighton said, confidence evident. "I've been developing ideas about operational efficiency, ways we could modernize systems while maintaining traditional strengths." "Tell me about your experience with digital integration," Darcy prompted. Silence stretched. "Well, I'm adaptable. Quick learner. At my previous position." "This is your first position in logistics, correct?" "Yes, but I've studied extensively. My degree focused on." The interview continued like that, Brighton talking around questions, trying to compensate for inexperience with enthusiasm. He wasn't terrible, just painfully ordinary. Exactly what Arlen Group didn't need. Darcy's notes were diplomatic: "Lacks technical skills for current openings. Recommend entry-level reassignment or severance offering." I approved the severance. Generous, professional, sufficient to cushion the transition. The offer letter went out on Friday. Brighton called me that evening, voice tight with confusion. "Did you hear? Thorne got bought out. They're letting people go." "I saw something about an acquisition," I said, stirring pasta sauce and watching steam rise. "They offered me severance. Like I'm not worth keeping." Hurt colored his words. "Dad's furious. He was going to recommend me for a promotion." "Maybe it's for the best," I suggested. "Chance to find something better suited to your skills." "Easy for you to say. You don't have a real career to lose." The words landed like they always did, casual cruelty disguised as observation. I breathed slowly, reminding myself this wasn't personal anymore, it was just momentum, consequences finding their natural conclusion. "You'll figure it out," I said. "You always do." After we hung up, I opened my laptop. The employee restructuring list showed 43 positions retained, 12 offered voluntary severance, 8 reassigned. Efficient. Clean. Exactly as planned. My father's application to the advisory board sat in my inbox, forwarded from Desmond Thorne with a note, "Old friend of mine. Excellent business mind. Would appreciate consideration." I replied to Desmond, "Will review him like any other candidate. Thanks for the recommendation." The advisory board didn't exist anymore. We dissolved it during acquisition, replacing it with a strategic development team that required specific technological expertise. My father's traditional consulting approach didn't fit. His rejection letter would be professionally worded. Respectful. Honest about organizational restructuring and changing needs. It would also be final. February brought phone calls I'd anticipated but still dreaded. Dad called first, voice sharp with frustration. This Arlen Group rejected my application. Didn't even grant an interview. That's unfortunate, I said, folding laundry and letting silence speak. I've been in this industry 30 years. 30 years, Kiara. Some tech startup thinks they know better than experience. Maybe they're looking for different expertise, I offered. Different expertise, he scoffed. They don't know what they're doing. Brighton got cut too. And your Aunt Petra's vendor contract wasn't renewed. The whole operation is being mismanaged by people who don't understand logistics. I hung towels in my closet, each fold precise. Did you look into who owns it? Some faceless corporation. Probably venture capitalists who'll strip it for parts and move on. That's what happens when you let inexperienced people make decisions. I agreed, non-committal. You're lucky you're not in this industry, he continued. Stay with your design projects. At least failure there doesn't affect anyone else. The call ended. I stood in my apartment, surrounded by evidence of success he refused to see, and felt nothing. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just the quiet recognition that some gaps could never be bridged, some people would never look closely enough to notice what was right in front of them. Mom called next, her approach gentler. Your father's upset about the Thorne situation. He feels disrespected. I heard. Kiara, I know you're building something. I don't understand it all, but I see you differently than he does. Do you? I asked, genuinely curious. You're like your grandmother, she said. Arlen. She didn't fit into conventional expectations either, but she built a life on her own terms. Your father loved her, but he never really understood her. He doesn't need to understand me, Mom. He just needs to respect that I'm competent. He does, in his way. He's just afraid. Of what? That you'll succeed differently than he did, and it'll prove his way wasn't the only right one. The honesty surprised me. We talked a while longer, about small things, weather and holidays and Freya's upcoming birthday. When we hung up, I felt lighter, some small burden of anger loosening. Maybe understanding wasn't necessary. Maybe distance was enough. Later that week, I attended an industry conference where Desmond Thorne gave a keynote about successful business transitions. He mentioned Arlen Group briefly, praising our approach to acquisition and integration. Afterward, people approached me. Not because they recognized me, because my badge identified me as Arlen Group's founder. They asked questions about our growth strategy, our logistics technology, our plans for expansion. I answered professionally, giving enough detail to seem transparent while protecting proprietary information. One investor handed me his card, suggesting dinner to discuss partnership opportunities. As I left the conference, I passed a group of older executives, Dad's generation, discussing the keynote. "These young companies," one said, shaking his head. "No respect for how things have always worked." I smiled and kept walking. Spring arrived gradually, winter releasing its grip one reluctant day at a time. Arlen Group continued expanding, acquiring 2 smaller firms and integrating their operations smoothly. Our client base doubled. Revenue projections exceeded expectations. I hired a CFO, someone with Fortune 500 experience who saw potential in what we were building. Her first action was implementing financial systems that would support scaling to national operations within 3 years. "You've built something remarkable," Vivian said during our weekly strategy meeting. "Most founders struggle with the transition from startup to established company. You seem to understand both worlds." "I had good teachers," I said, thinking of all the people who doubted me, each dismissal sharpening my determination. Freya emailed asking about internship opportunities. She was exploring colleges, considering business programs, wanted to understand what modern entrepreneurship looked like beyond traditional corporate paths. I set up a call, explaining Arlen Group's structure, how we'd grown, what skills mattered in contemporary business environments. She listened carefully, asking sharp questions that reminded me of myself at her age. "Your dad thinks I'm wasting time," she admitted. "He wants me to go into finance like Callum." "What do you want?" "I want to build things. Like you." "Then do that," I said. "And don't apologize for it." After the call, I drafted an internship offer, pending her high school graduation. She could work in operations or strategy development, whichever interested her more. Some cycles could be broken. Some patterns didn't have to repeat. Summer brought family reunion plans, an annual tradition held at Dad's house. Normally I'd avoid it, claiming work conflicts, but this year felt different. Lighter. Like I'd finally stopped carrying weight that was never mine to bear. I arrived Saturday afternoon, the yard already crowded with relatives. Brighton was there, working at a new firm, talking about fresh starts with forced optimism. Petra chatted with cousins, carefully avoiding any mention of Thorn Logistics. Dad stood by the grill, holding court as always. When he saw me, his expression flickered, something between discomfort and defiance. "Kiera," he said, tone carefully neutral. "Glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, meaning it. Throughout the afternoon, I noticed changes. Brighton didn't boast. Petra didn't ask about my computer thing. Even Dad seemed quieter, less certain in his pronouncements about how business should work. During dinner, Callum asked about Arlen Group. I saw an article in Forbes about logistics innovation. They mentioned some company called Arlen. Any relation to Grandma? The table went still. Dad's fork stopped mid-air. "It's named after her," I said simply. "You work there?" Theodora asked. "I founded it." Silence stretched, everyone processing. Brighton stared at his plate. Petra's mouth opened slightly. Dad's face drained of color. "Wait," Callum said slowly. "You own Arlen Group? The company that bought Thorn?" "Yes." More silence. Then Freya started laughing, a bright sound that broke the tension. "Of course you do. That's so perfect." Questions came in a rush after that. How long? How big? Why didn't I say anything? I answered patiently, explaining growth trajectory, acquisition strategy, future plans. Some relatives looked impressed. Others confused. Brighton excused himself, disappearing into the house. Dad said nothing. Just sat there, processing, his worldview restructuring in real time. Later, after most relatives had left, he found me in the kitchen. Mom was outside saying goodbyes. We were alone. "You let me criticize you," he said finally. "For years." "Yes." "Why?" I dried the last dish, considering. Because defending myself to someone who'd already decided I was failing seemed pointless. I chose to prove myself through results instead of arguments. I would have listened. No, Dad. You wouldn't have. You'd have found reasons why it didn't count, why it wasn't real success by your standards. So I built something you couldn't dismiss, and I didn't ask for your permission to do it. He leaned against the counter, suddenly looking older. I was wrong. Yes, you were. I don't know how to fix that. I set down the towel, meeting his eyes. You don't fix it. You just accept it. Accept that your way isn't the only way. Accept that you missed watching me build something because you were too busy deciding I'd already failed. I'm proud of you, he said, voice rough. I know. But I don't need that anymore. I needed it when I was 22 and scared. Now I just need you to respect that I'm competent, even when you don't understand what I'm doing. He nodded slowly. We stood in the kitchen, years of misunderstanding between us, and I felt the shift. Not reconciliation, not yet. But maybe the beginning of honest recognition. Fall brought more growth. Arlen Group expanded into 3 new regions, hired 40 employees, secured contracts with major retailers. Industry publications ran features about our innovative logistics solutions and non-traditional corporate structure. I did interviews carefully, always crediting my team, never positioning myself as some lone genius. Because I wasn't. I'd just been stubborn enough to keep building when everyone expected me to quit, flexible enough to adapt when markets shifted, and patient enough to wait for results to speak louder than explanations. Dad and I talked occasionally now. Brief calls, mostly professional. He'd ask about business strategy, and I'd answer, our conversations more honest than they'd been in years. He started reading articles about technology integration in logistics, trying to understand the industry's evolution. I'm thinking about retiring, he mentioned during one call. The consulting requests have dried up. Companies want different expertise now. What will you do? I asked. I don't know yet. Maybe that's okay. Mom reported that he'd started volunteering at a business mentorship program, working with young entrepreneurs. He's learning to listen, she said. Finally. Brighton sent an email apologizing for past comments. His new position was going well, he wrote, and he'd learned valuable lessons about humility. I responded graciously, wishing him continued success. Petra called to congratulate me, her voice warm without pity. I always knew you had it in you, she said, the kind of rewriting history that happens when people realize they misjudged someone. I didn't correct her. Let them remember it however they needed to. December arrived with early snow, the city transforming into something quieter, softer. Arlen Group held its first official holiday party at a downtown venue, employees and partners gathering to celebrate a remarkable year. Darcy gave a toast thanking everyone for their dedication. Vivian outlined projections for the coming year, ambitious but achievable. I stood near the back, watching my team, these people who'd believed in the vision when it was just sketches on a whiteboard. Freya attended as our summer intern, now a college freshman studying business technology. She'd fit perfectly into our culture, asking questions that challenged assumptions and proposing solutions that bridged traditional wisdom with modern innovation. Next year, she said, finding me by the window, I want to work on the expansion project. If you'll have me. We'd be lucky to have you, I said honestly. As the party wound down, I stepped outside for air. The city glittered with holiday lights, traffic flowing in steady streams, everything moving forward. My phone buzzed with a message from Mom. Dad wants to know if you're coming to Christmas dinner. He promises to behave. I smiled, typing back, I'll be there. Tell him to save me a seat. Not at the far end this time. Not in the invisible spot. Just somewhere in the middle, where family gathers because they choose to, not because they're obligated to perform. Inside, someone called my name. Time to rejoin the celebration, to stand with the people who saw what I'd built and helped make it real. The party continued into the night, laughter and conversation filling spaces where doubt used to live. And somewhere across the city, in a house with brick and tradition, my father was probably reading about Arlen Group's recent acquisition announcement, trying to understand how his daughter had built an empire he'd been too busy dismissing to notice until it already existed. Maybe next Christmas, when he raised his glass, he'd toast to something different. Not to traditional success or conventional paths, but to the stubborn resilience of people who build despite doubt, who create despite dismissal, who prove that the future belongs to those brave enough to imagine it differently. But even if he didn't, even if nothing changed, I'd still be okay. Because I'd learned the most important lesson: success doesn't need witnesses. It just needs to exist. And mine finally did. Winter deepened. The holidays approached with familiar anxiety, but this year carried different weight. I'd spent years dreading family gatherings, bracing for criticism disguised as concern. Now I drove toward my parents' house with something resembling peace. The driveway was already crowded when I arrived. Callum's SUV. Theodora's hybrid. Brighton's sedan, because he'd been invited too, the grudges quietly set aside in that way families have of pretending past hurts never happened. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and pine. Mom hugged me at the door, holding on longer than necessary. "He's nervous," she whispered. "Give him grace." I nodded, hanging my coat in the familiar closet. Dad stood in the living room, adjusting decorations that didn't need adjusting. When our eyes met, something passed between us, acknowledgement of changed circumstances. He extended his hand formally, a gesture that felt absurd and appropriate simultaneously. "Kiara. Thank you for coming." "Of course," I said, shaking it. The evening unfolded differently than previous years. Conversations included me naturally, people asking genuine questions about Arlen Group's operations rather than making polite small talk to fill space. Brighton discussed his new position without false bravado. Petra complimented my strategic thinking without condescension. During dinner, Dad didn't make toasts about real success or stable futures. Instead, he raised his glass simply, to family, and to learning. Everyone drank. Including me. After dessert, Dad pulled me aside to his study. The room smelled like leather and old books, unchanged since childhood. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "I've been thinking about Christmas 2 years ago," he began. "The things I said." "We don't need to rehash it," I interrupted gently. "No, we do." His voice was firm. "I dismissed you publicly. Repeatedly. I praised Brighton for accomplishments that were ordinary while treating your extraordinary work as if it didn't exist. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology hung between us, imperfect but sincere. "I think," he continued slowly, "I was threatened. Not consciously, but somewhere deep. You were building something I didn't understand, succeeding in ways I couldn't measure. Easier to dismiss it than admit the world had changed and I hadn't changed with it." "I get it," I said, and meant it. "Your metrics made sense for your generation. But business evolved. Technology changed everything. I had to build differently." "You built better," he admitted. "More sustainable. More innovative." I should have recognized that sooner. We sat in comfortable silence, years of tension finally releasing. Outside, laughter drifted from the living room where my siblings played games with younger cousins. "Can I ask something?" Dad said finally. "Sure. That book I gave you. The late bloomer one. Did you read it?" I smiled. "I donated it." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind I rarely heard. "Good. That was stupid. I'm sorry." Apology accepted. Spring brought unexpected changes. Dad sold his consulting business, using the money to fund a scholarship program for non-traditional students pursuing entrepreneurship. Kira helped design the criteria, Mom told me during a phone call. He wanted to support people taking unconventional paths. Freya thrived at college, already launching a small tech startup with classmates. She called monthly for advice, and I gave it freely, remembering how desperately I'd wanted guidance at her age. Brighton and I developed an unlikely friendship, meeting occasionally for coffee. He'd grown humbler after the Thorn experience, more aware of how privilege and assumption had shaped his early career. "You could have destroyed me," he said once. "You had every reason to." "That was never the goal," I replied. "The goal was building something sustainable. You were just collateral to organizational restructuring." "Still," he insisted. "You showed more grace than I deserved." Maybe. Or maybe I'd just learned that revenge and justice weren't the same thing. Revenge meant intentional harm. Justice meant natural consequences. I'd simply allowed the latter to unfold. Arlen Group continued expanding, now operating in 12 states with plans for international partnerships. The team I'd assembled worked with shared purpose, building something that mattered beyond quarterly earnings. Summer brought the annual reunion again. This time, when I arrived, Dad was waiting by the door. Not to criticize. Not to compare. Just to greet me. "Kira," he said warmly. "Come help me with the grill." We stood together flipping burgers, talking about market trends and technological innovation. He asked intelligent questions, genuinely curious about approaches that differed from his traditional methods. "I've been reading about AI integration in logistics," he mentioned. "Fascinating stuff. You implementing any of that?" "We're testing pilot programs," I explained. Cautiously. "The technology has potential, but it needs to complement human judgment, not replace it." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's wise. Balance between innovation and practicality." Around us, family mingled. Freya showed her startup prototype to interested cousins. Theodora discussed fundraising strategies with Petra. Callum played volleyball with nephews and nieces. Normal. Healthy. The way families should be when they choose connection over competition. During dinner, no one mentioned my past struggles or questionable choices. They asked about current projects, future plans, industry challenges. Conversations flowed naturally, respect replacing pity. As the evening wound down, Dad found me again. "I know I can't change the past," he said quietly. "But I hope we can build something different going forward." "We already are," I assured him. Fall arrived with crisp air and changing leaves. Arlen Group celebrated its 5th anniversary with a gala event honoring employees and partners who'd contributed to our growth. The venue sparkled with elegant decorations, people in formal attire mingling over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I'd invited my family. All of them. They came dressed in their best, looking slightly uncomfortable in the corporate elegance but genuinely proud. Mom beamed throughout the evening, introducing herself as Kira's mother with obvious joy. Dad networked carefully, asking thoughtful questions rather than lecturing about his expertise. Brighton attended with Sloane, both offering congratulations without awkwardness. Theodora brought her board members, interested in potential partnership opportunities between Arlen Group and her nonprofit. When I gave my speech thanking everyone who'd made this possible, I looked out at the crowd and saw something beautiful, a community built on mutual respect, shared vision, and genuine collaboration. 5 years ago, I said, I started this company in a studio apartment with more determination than resources. I didn't know if it would work. I just knew I had to try, because the alternative was accepting someone else's definition of my potential. Applause rippled through the room. Today, Arlen Group employs over 200 people, serves clients across 12 states, and continues innovating in an industry that desperately needs modernization. None of this happened because I'm exceptional. It happened because I surrounded myself with people who believed in building something better. More applause. I caught Dad's eye. He nodded, understanding finally settling in his expression. December arrived with the first real snow, the kind that transforms everything into quiet beauty. I stood at my office window watching flakes drift past, thinking about how far I'd traveled, not in distance but in becoming. 5 years earlier, I'd sat in that studio apartment wondering if I'd made terrible mistakes. If my father was right. If choosing uncertainty over security meant I'd fail spectacularly and publicly. But I hadn't failed. I'd built. Slowly, carefully, sustainably. And in building, I'd discovered something more valuable than my father's approval, my own confidence. Christmas dinner approached. This year, I'd volunteered to host at my new house, the one I'd purchased last month with a mortgage I could comfortably afford. The one with space for gathering, for celebration, for family choosing to be together rather than performing obligation. Mom called to confirm menu details. Dad texted asking if he could bring wine, a small gesture toward participation rather than judgment. My siblings coordinated arrival times. Even Brighton and Sloan were coming, their presence no longer uncomfortable but genuinely welcome. As I prepared for the gathering, setting tables and arranging flowers, I thought about that Christmas 2 years ago. The toast that cut. The laughter that hurt. The moment I'd decided silence was more powerful than defense. I'd been right. Not because silence was revenge, but because it created space for building. For proving. For becoming exactly who I was meant to be without seeking permission or validation. Tomorrow, when family gathered around my table, Dad might toast to success again. But this time, he'd be toasting to mine. Not because I'd forced recognition, but because I'd built something impossible to ignore, something that existed completely independent of his opinion. And if he didn't toast? If he stayed quiet, still processing his changed perspective? That would be okay too. Because I'd learned the most important lesson. Other people's recognition was lovely when it came, but it wasn't necessary. I'd built Arlen Group. I'd built my career. I'd built my life. And that was enough. Outside, snow continued falling, covering everything in fresh white silence. Inside, warmth waited. Family would arrive tomorrow. Stories would be shared. Connections would deepen. But tonight, I stood alone in my house, surrounded by evidence of choices made bravely, and felt completely, perfectly whole. Some victories aren't loud. They're just real. And real lasts forever. Thank you for watching this story. If moments like these resonate with you, if you've ever had to choose yourself over people who couldn't see you, then you're not alone. We share stories like this every single day, real accounts of people who found their voice, set their boundaries, and walked into the life they deserved. Subscribe so you never miss next upload, and share your own story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Merry Christmas. I love you all.
Stars are shining bright on this holy night. Peace is filling every heart tonight. Children laughing, voices sing with cheer. Love and joy are everywhere near. Beautiful Christmas, full of delight, love and hope, shining so bright. Bells are ringing, hearts are free. Jesus was born to light the world you see. cheer. This holy night, love draws near. Beautiful Christmas, full of delight, peace and joy in every life. Bells are ringing, hearts are free. Jesus was born for you and me. Merry Christmas, let love remain God's forever love.